Welcome to this webinar for CTA. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on the planet and when you're listening to this. I'm very pleased to be joined by Joe Chen, Dorit Dor, and John Petrie today to have a discussion about what happened and what didn't happen in 2022. I think we've got a lot of interesting topics to discuss today, and I'm very excited to launch into that discussion. I'm going to go around and let them introduce themselves very briefly so that you know who you're talking to. I'm Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. So, Joe.
Oh, hi, I'm Joe Chen. I am a VP of Engineering at Symantec Enterprise Division, a division of Broadcom.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Dorit.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dorit Dor. I manage all the R&D and products for Checkpoint, as well as some of the emerging markets.
Okay. And John.
Hello, my name is John Petrie. I am the counselor to the global CSO for NTT Corporation. That translates into Western terms as Deputy CISO. I carry multiple titles, including the CEO of NTT Security US. And I'm pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great. So when we look back over the course of 2022, and in fact, actually, before we got on the call, we were discussing how predictions for the World Cup didn't turn out quite the way that, or the World Cup results have not turned out the way that the predictions turned out. And that has also been true in cyberspace. You know, there was a prediction at the beginning of the year that we were practically going to see cyber Armageddon across the West and in the United States if the Russians invaded Ukraine. They invaded Ukraine, but cyber Armageddon didn't materialize. The Log4j vulnerability came out, and you know, everyone predicted that that would be immediately used by everyone to, you know, wreck the entire economy. And that cyber criminals would just run rampant with it. Ransomware, in fact, hit, you know, very much a peak in 2021 in many ways. And many people thought that 2022 would be at least a repeat, if not even worse. But not all of that materialized. That doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of bad things that happened in cyberspace this year, of course. And the reality, as usual, is much more nuanced than the media stories would lead you to believe. So today we're going to talk about what happened, what didn't happen, and a little bit of why, and talk about where we might be going in 2023. And at the risk of being wrong, we will also try to make some predictions for 2023. And we will see if we'll see how good we are come December of 2023. But let's start with that, with what's going on in Ukraine. And you know, looking at the media reports in late January or February of 2022, you know, a casual reader could have been forgiven for thinking that a kinetic war in Ukraine would bring widespread, you know, cyber disruption in the West through cyberspace. And when that didn't happen, the media narrative shifted to, therefore, nothing's happening in cyberspace. And naturally, the reality is somewhere in between. So what I wanted to ask is, how has the war in Ukraine actually played out from your perspective? And John, let me just start with you, because I know you've got some particular thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think certainly the press's view of it, that nothing happened, is absolutely incorrect. And from a perspective of business disruption, there was disruption. And certainly for even NTT's assets within Europe, we had some struggles with some lateral movement from the attacks that the Russians or their subsidiaries were doing on Ukraine that were overflowing into areas like Poland, for example, which we have a significant amount of assets there. And I think from that perspective, the attacks weren't as heavy. I think that's a correct statement, but the fact is that they did hit certain parts of Ukraine's infrastructure and did make lateral movements across into other countries. So from a business perspective, yeah, we felt it. Could it have been worse? Absolutely. But from our viewpoint, this created some analytical concerns as it relates to geopolitics specifically, not necessarily, cyber attacks. But what the thinking was initially was that they weren't using their entire arsenal of cyber attacks against Ukraine because they were preparing for a much larger campaign. Again, that didn't materialize, at least not yet. And then I know we're talking about the future. This is absolutely a study for what could be a possibility in the Far East. So from our perspective, attacks did increase, not as much. Certainly the media view that nothing happened is incorrect.
Yeah, Dorit, do you want to add anything onto that?
Yeah. So I want to add a few things. First, we've seen attacks before the official war started. And attacks oftentimes are used alongside intelligence and the intelligence collection phases. And we did see some attacks over there as part of the war and preparation for the war, targeted attacks, trying to take down things, trying to hold on to more intelligence, etc. Once the forces were inside, they indeed didn't use all the imaginary tools that they could have been used to take down things. But you could also say that maybe they didn't want to do it while they were there, or because at the end, they wanted to conquer the land and take them as citizens. It's not, they didn't want to burn the land. They wanted to take the land. It's a different position. And there would be multiple other guesses. But attacks did happen. But the thing that happened more, I did some research with the team, and I think that there were a few things that happened that could signify the future, kind of trends that may later impact to trends. So I'll name them shortly, and then we could talk about them when we talk about the future. But one was that there were country extortion. Some of the country extortion, you could say maybe was unrelated, kind of experimenting new weapon on country extortion. But there was country extortion among countries that took sides. Montenegro, Albania, they had some sides into this, and they got extortion as a tool. Extortion, ransomware, depends on what you want. But there is a trend of country extortion. This is quite big, actually. This is kind of a war by itself. The second trend that I could also share more data is about disruptive malware. If before there was kind of one wiper a year, this year there were 9 wipers. And some of these wipers were wipers specifically around Ukraine, Russia. Some of them even proliferated to other countries, like John said. So some of the things that hit other countries were wipers that were spread to other countries. And the third thing is kind of the creation and proliferation of state-mobilized hacktivism. So there were many groups created that are actually quite an organized groups. So maybe it's not kind of the army attacking the army as part of the cyber war, but there is a whole thing. So there are many things. There are more things I'll say when we talk about the future later, but these are dramatic trends that did happen and may have a huger use and effect later in cyber, and impacted maybe not directly the forces on the ground, but impacted the whole environment around this, and companies taking sides and helping sides, etc. It's quite a big deal.
Yeah, I think your point about country extortion is incredibly important. Albania, Costa Rica, and I think also like the development of the IT army on the Ukrainian side, the way the Russians have harnessed their criminal underground on the Russian side. I mean, all of those are interesting aspects, and I think in hugely important aspects. What I think it continues to point to, though, is that cyber operations are not going to be used in the way that people necessarily thought they were. In other words, I think there was a lot of thinking that you would use cyber capabilities like we use artillery or airstrikes, right? And I don't think it's actually as useful for those kinds of activities, especially like if you already have artillery and you already have air power, why wouldn't you just use those when you know they work? Whereas there's a lot more uncertainty with what happens with cyber capabilities. But I think the three things that you listed, Dorit, are really important, and we'll sort of pick up on that in just a second. But Joe, is there anything you wanted to add to the conversation so far?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. On top of what John and Dorit are sharing, internally, I've been having some conversations with Eric Chen and Omerchu, the two gentlemen who conducted the research on the Stuxnet, perhaps the First Nation state incident almost over 10 years ago. I think even then we will know that such things is here to stay and it will continue to evolve, right? So what the gentleman shared with me and want me to kind of also kind of share with the audience here is say we saw plenty of exploits of things like Log4j. So for example, Bloodworm, right? It's actually for the first time this year in many years now we saw attacks against U.S. entities this year, right? For a very long time, they were targeting more Middle East, Asia, European countries, but the first time now it's here. As far as trend, they certainly exploited proxy logon and Log4j vulnerabilities, and we also saw a big shift towards on-prem data centers, right? So these are kind of our trends we can further discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I think it continues to just reinforce the idea that doing something to somebody somewhere on the internet is trivially easy, but having the impact that you want at the time and place of your choosing, only the impact that you want, and precisely controlling it, we still really can't do that in cyberspace. And that means that the way that adversaries use these tools, the way that nation states use these tools is going to be different. So, I think one of the other questions that I wanted us to just briefly talk about was, of course, the war isn't over yet. And I also think that, when it does end, if it ends anything like it in its current state, which is not anything great for Russia from its perspective, Russia could decide that that's the time that you actually want to, Dorit, to your point, that they no longer think they're going to own the land, so now we can burn it. And we have nothing left to lose with the West. So, I mean, do you think that the attacks that were feared before the war might actually, in fact, materialize after the war, or be more likely to materialize? Anybody can sort of jump on that.
Yeah. I think that one of the challenges, which is also what you touched upon on why we are not so surgical in what we attack and when, is that once you kind of won an estate somewhere in order to formalize an attack, it's not totally in your control when this position will end. So one would take this, okay, so if I already have a position, I'll take everything in a very short while, and I'll try to win as much as I can in a short window. This is one type of attacks. Another approach would be, okay, I'll take it low and slow, and I'll try to hide myself for as long as I can, and I'll really do it very slowly. But at the end, we also don't know how much it will hold. There could be other forces outside that even randomly will find something and will take us apart. So one of the questions is, if Russia had holds of states in Ukraine, are they still in existence? So we don't really know this if they are silent. If they are silent and waiting for due date, we don't know how much there is. But there is a chance that Ukraine changed enough to kind of transform some key holdings, if there were holdings by now, because a lot of things moved, data centers moved, a lot of IT changed form just because they were forced to, so they made a lot of changes. So one option is that they actually don't have that much ground. And another option is that, yes, they are sitting low and slow right now, and they are waiting for the due date by which they could all shout go and do something. I'm not sure we could really know this. So it's hard to tell where we stand.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it just goes back to this theme of uncertainty. But John, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I think to continue with Dorit's thought with regard to data centers specifically. So, we know for, publicly released that a lot of the resources were moved into external data centers, primarily Romania and Poland at this point, as nearest we can tell. So is it the attack sequences that we talked about in conjunction with a political decision, whatever that might be, will they begin to start crossing the line? And then you've got the whole NATO issue from a geopolitical perspective that enters into the picture. I think, from the attack scenarios that we've experienced, the fact is that they could go after those data center completely undetected potentially, or unidentified. And the way they're using their surrogates is interesting too. They're almost crowdsourcing some things for specific reasons, of which I'm not sure we understand what those reasons are, but there are collective crowdsourcing evolutions that the GIU is conducting. So I think those are all things that we can probably foresee or anticipate that will happen, in the coming months, depending on, the outcome of the ground war. And certainly negotiations now enter into the picture, which drive other decisions. So again, I think that's probably something we can anticipate.
Yeah. So I wanted to turn, and so that's kind of that picture, and there's a lot more to come from, I think, a lot more chapters to play out. There's the level of Western support for Ukraine. Ukraine has been fighting Russia in cyberspace for at least 7 or 8 years now. Plus, you also have the fact that the Russians are fighting, the A-teams from a lot of companies around the world, as well as the Ukrainians themselves. All of these factor into what has happened and what has not happened there. I think, Joe, you had raised the log4j situation that I had hit on. And I think, again, this comes back to some of this is really also about how we as a cybersecurity industry talk about these kinds of vulnerabilities and sort of how they get used. And there's often, I think, for marketing purposes, a lot of, hyperbolic language that gets used with these things. And certainly log4j was a very dangerous vulnerability. And as you pointed out, it's been used, but, I wanted to maybe explore a little bit about sort of why, even though it is a very dangerous vulnerability, that didn't translate into sort of the criminals or nation states' ability to just sort of lay waste to anything in their path. You want to, pick that apart a little bit, Joe?
Yeah, if we're zooming in on a from a pure volume, if media were to zoom in just pure volume of incidents, like we had an internal theory or hypothesis, which is, the Conti group, through infighting, they were exposed, right? Their chat logs were exposed. Identity of many group developers were all exposed. So, could that have led to the arrest or the targets of the individuals? Would that be the reason, that have led to some decrease in certain areas? So I don't know. We don't know. But we overall though we see even more now we saw a lot more attacks to network peripherals, remote execution exploits against VPNs, firewalls, exchange servers, et cetera, and we saw even crazier attack chain, very sophisticated. HTML files leading to a zip file, leading to an ISO image, leading to a link file, right? The Lapsus group breaching a major company, showing a path forward against 2FA, social engineering. Okay, social engineering credential stealing is becoming potentially one of the easiest paths to attack, for an attack against an entity, right? SIM swapping, 2FA proxying, multi-factor. There's the push fatigue, right? People now are just, when they see it, they just click, right? So depending on how that's implemented, whether it's government agencies or large private entities, that all become an issue. With deep pockets, paying employees, suppliers, business partners of targets, instead of going direct, they're going indirect, right? So the advertisement, they can reach you, the reaching is much further. Reddit, Telegram, right? They can attack employees' personal email account to target an organization. Even management companies, why not just attack against help desk to help reset password? Why get the password, reset it? And what else? There were attack against Confluence. Get in, and instead of going to a system, go to Slack, go to Confluence. Look at the source. Look at the admin scripts. Often the passwords embedded in these scripts themselves, right? So I think the list goes on and on. So, and these are, I think the sophistication and level of effort did not decrease a bit.
Yeah.
I had some additional observation, if I may, on Log4j.
Please.
I want to say that prevention does work sometimes, and Log4j was preventable by many. So Checkpoint believes in prevention first, and we deliver a lot of capability in prevention, but we are not. It's not just us. There are many in Log4j case, many other tools created prevention for Log4j attacks. And I think that by understanding that this is a very severe case, if you want, the hype messaging of the marketing was correct, in my opinion. More people protected themselves in a way that was doable. If they weren't like negligence, they put in front of the kind of the external places some protection against it, and maybe more of the attacks were blocks and some discouraged even. Yeah, I know that it's always also the time before the attack, maybe how many people knew about it before. I know we were preemptive in some sense to this attack in our web application and API protection. So you could have blocked it before, but I think that the window was closed because people realized it's an important attack and use prevention to reduce the attack surface in that.
I agree. I didn't talk to Dorit or John ahead of this, but as far as I think we all agree, especially with these high profile vulnerabilities, they're going to go after high value targets, your data centers, right? Yeah. And I completely agree with Dorit's view on protection and prevention, right? I think that's absolutely key. And data centers lockdown. This is just a week before, I guess, turning 2022, some of the largest bank, finance customers were reaching out to us. It's what are we doing with Log4j? So we said lockdown, lock it down, lock down your servers, right? So with that, you have protection, and you can patch your systems. So I agree with that approach.
Yeah, I think, I agree 100%. Prevention is key. I think the initial hype, once it was announced, I think the notifications moved very quickly. Certainly for us as a global entity, we saw multiple countries, begin to raise the alarm, and therefore a lot of our clients were moving very quickly to close the door, if you will, as Dorit mentioned. So I think that was unique. We had enough, I guess, of advance warning, and it went very quickly that the exploitable window was really closed down to a small area. Now, having said that, there's still concerns where companies didn't take action, and
Right.
the supply chain could be affected in the future. So we're still a bit, apprehensive about, did everybody do everything they would, like Joe's comment about just locking them down? Did they do what they needed to do, and is that going to have some effect in the future? Maybe in a timing issue with another type of attack. So those are always possibilities.
Sure. Yeah, no, those are all really good points. And I think again, when you have these kind of outlier type of vulnerabilities, which actually really don't come along very often, there's only a handful, maybe one or two a year, people can react much faster. And as a result, you get a selection bias there. I think the third issue that I mentioned was ransomware. And one of the interesting sort of things is that if you talk to, a lot of the major insurance companies, and even initially some of the government speakers were talking about how ransomware attacks, the number of them appeared to be down in 2022. The percentage that the ransom demands were down. And yet certainly my sort of just look at what all of you as CTA members are reporting, and what we could see across the landscape, that didn't seem to match up. So what's going on here? How can we explain this sort of seeming disconnect between what the security world is seeing versus insurance versus governments, and what do we think is going on here?
So if you want, I could start with some insights. I think that some of the ransomware attackers moved from like spray and pray into a more targeted and dedicated focus of attack that maybe created less in volume and more in kind of valuable targets weaponing. I think that this is part of it is to kind of extract more value, and part of it is a more organized anti-ransomware kind of trends, that more forces are kind of researching them and trying to take over operations that seem to be creating a lot of noise. So you're trying to weaponize the really high value targets of not allowing people to pay for ransomware. So we start to see some trends that say, you shouldn't pay. It's non-legitimate to pay for it. And then you kind of decide if it's worth being a kind of a wiper or a extortion kind of method to begin with, versus the ransomware. If less people are trying to get the keys and to recover the data. I think it goes also to the cycles of ransomware, because they started with just ransomware, and then they did double extortion that, hey, I will both encrypt your data and I leak your data. And there was even triple extortion. I will encrypt your data, I will leak your data, and I will extort also your clients that have the data. Right. So once it became that convoluted, the client said, I'm not going to pay because they have already my data and they could publish the data any day. And it's kind of counterintuitive. So I think, as I said at the beginning, we also see many more wipers in 2022. So maybe less people paying, maybe more targeted attacks for the value, and maybe the fear of kind of being closed down if you're making too much noise.
No, that makes sense. Joe or John, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think monetary incentive is there could be direct or indirect. I think we need to also think about like the attack on the entire supply chain. So many of the vendors, not only you are a target, you're also a target for the vendor or customer that you serve, right? So some of the for example, like here's like a list of kind of names of folks like has credentials stolen, right? So how would your customer view you? Would that also have financial impact on you, and how would that impact kind of further down the line? So for example, I think NVIDIA had their schematic driver firmware source, right, stolen, and Samsung 190 gigs of Galaxy biometrics data, Vodafone 200 gigs of source, Microsoft Bing Map, Cortana source code, Uber Slack Confidence Stash, Rockstar other source code, right? GTA 6 source code, Twilio customer account. A lot of people use Twilio and customer account credentials and 2FA codes. Ubisoft, Brazil Ministry, et cetera, et cetera. The cascading supply chain of such, how would that impact the economy? How would that incentivize or otherwise for the attacker? That's something I think we need to kind of think a little more about how we wrap our heads around it.
I think to get to the disparity between the insurance companies and what cyber professionals are seeing or cyber organizations are seeing, I think there's a clearly a withdrawal from the insurance companies, carrying coverage for cyber incidents. So that pile of money that would normally be used as an incentive for an attacker to go after a specific company because of high value that they're going to make a payment and the insurance is going to cover it is slightly, deteriorating at a rapid rate. Given also that the insurance policies are becoming more and more expensive, the idea of maybe companies moving, especially large companies, moving to, self-insurance, where we're going to take the risk. We're going to make a bet that our preventive measures are going to be very effective, and we're going to have a limited amount of exposure. Therefore, we're not going to pay a ransomware, and second, we're not going to have insurance cover certain aspects. So those kinds of things are thinking. So the disparity that's being reported by the insurance company from the actuator perspective is that companies aren't reporting certain incidences; they're dealing with them directly, and so I think that's problematic in sort of getting a good feel of what's going on in this area. As far as the attacks themselves are concerned, I think there's going to be a point where there's going to be some more sophistication, not just for the end result of being paid, but the attackers are going to be using those capabilities and threats to open other doors. And so I think that is more of an area where, as professionals, we need to start looking and seeing what that might impact in our environments.
Yeah, and I think.
By the way,
Sure.
yeah.
Go ahead, Dorit.
Another aspect that relates to the Ukraine and Russia war, or if you want to, the whole geopolitical situation, is that the difference between government and activism and mercenaries is more complicated. So if you are in insurance, I mean, if somebody like an enemy bombed my house, it's one thing for the insurance company not to vote. But if it's a mercenary or an activism or kind of a gray area, it becomes more sophisticated to know. This is a totally different complication for the insurance companies to decide kind of what they are willing to pay for.
Right.
Yeah. And if we end up in a world where sort of everything is declared to be, the arm of a nation state and therefore isn't covered by cyber insurance, then who will have cyber insurance? It sort of becomes self-defeating. But then if you don't
But
do
on the
that,
other hand, you're not willing to necessarily, as an insurance, pay for some hidden government operation that
Right.
kind of wasn't the intention of the insurer. It was about cybercrime. Now the cybercrime is very deeply involved with the mercenaries and kind of the governments themselves.
yeah. So we're, getting to where we got about 10 or 15 minutes left in the discussion. And so what I wanted to kind of turn to is, what are some of the other new threats that you saw sort of emerge this year? We started to talk about some of those. Dorit, you mentioned the wipers, for example. And what are some of these trends that are going to be carrying forward into 2023? So, Joe, maybe we'll start with you on that score.
I guess some of the same things we saw in 2022 will likely continue. Targets against code repository, the Python packages, against network appliances, your Aruba Edge Connects and JuneOS devices, and such. I think targeting Linux using remote exploits. One of the things we also saw was disabling drivers, right? And using network management consoles and tools as a way to bypass or even sometimes exonerate or whitelist malicious activity, right? We think there'll be more zero-day in use in the wild also. And lastly, I think target using multiple factor authentication bypass. I think that's all that trend will also continue in 2023.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, and I agree with Joe's assessments there, but I think the specific targeting of the API structures, I think, is going to increase. I think there's going to be a directed effort to try to target very specific APIs and exploit those, and then move very rapidly across the API connections to your main systems, especially within the cloud connections. I think that's an area that we're going to see more prominent in 23. I agree with the network, and certainly in our business, the data centers are going to be under attack, and I think to bring into perspective, at least from our point of view, we live in the Pacific area, so the whole idea of what is China going to do next, and the Taiwan situation, the northern disputed Russian islands of Japan, for us, that is increasingly becoming more critical. But more importantly, can we take what we learned from the Russian attacks, and are they going to become more sophisticated? Given Dorit's comment with regard to sort of the subsidiaries of the nation states, the crowdsourcing of certain attack scenarios, and how we're going to deal with that across the board, I think is going to start surfacing in 23.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, John. And I think particularly, the thread that you pulled on there is that nothing in cyberspace is independent of what's happening in the real world. That it is not an ethereal domain off on its own, that it's actually deeply connected with what's happening in the real world. And geopolitics is going to drive a lot of what actually happens. Dorit, any thoughts you want to have?
Yeah, so one thing I want to do is extend the kind of the API opening to a cloud thing in general. We became more and more dependent on cloud resources. The cloud has very little layers of defense, and every stupid thing becomes like a huge problem. Mistake or not mistake, but if we look at how somebody stole all the information from Optus about the Australian citizens. Then there was an API open that you just had to write down a phone number and you could get all the data. Ask yourself how many things you have published somewhere by somebody that you don't even know are exposed to something. So cloud in general, cloud by mistake, cloud by kind of lack of control or in different ways. This is an extension of this. And another extension that I wanted to make in the geopolitical thing, we are kind of, if we spent many years on globalization, we are in a deglobalization moment right now. People are taking sides, there are sides, and sides are fighting with the other sides, and they become very innovative in creating tools. So aside from the wipers I mentioned, country extortion, if it becomes a habit, this is a major thing for the operation of the world. But using the activism groups and blurring the place between a country and a group, now you have a group that maybe started from an activism ideology, but hey, why let's not make some money now? Okay, we already have the operation. These are very, very structured operations. They sometimes have a very consistent political thing, but they have a very clear hierarchy and leadership, and sometimes even very clear public relations, and they publish what they do with formal recruitment. It's like a whole organization. So now, in a sense, the countries are not just building their own army, but they are building kind of side armies. What they would do next, I don't know if all the people there, but some of the people will just leverage the operation that got built to do something. And then we could ask, what would they do? They would use identity issues and phishing challenges, and they would use supply chain to the best that they can, and they would use 0 days to the best that they can, and they would do wipers and somewhere and all the other things, and would steal from the cloud. So all the other things just at the hand of, just like the army that so far was fighting on the government control, in the hands of kind of operation that you're not clear who's controlling it.
No,
I think I see the organization. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, we see the organization, like even in the software engineering process of these attackers. We see maturity in the growth of the attackers. Yeah, they're building 64-bit. They're using safe code. They have their whole management of software life cycle on its own. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing to watch like quality control being done on like malware, right?
Yeah.
So I think to close out our discussion, I will just pose one question for you. If there is one thing that you think the cybersecurity industry needs to do to adapt to these changes, to the changing geopolitics, to those competing technospheres that Dorit mentioned, the competition between China and the West, for example. What is one thing that you think the cybersecurity industry needs to do to adapt? So I'll start with Dorit for this one. Yes.
So, I'll ask the genie for 2 in my first ask, and then I get 2. So first, I'll keep with my philosophy. We have to not give up on prevention, and we have to stop attacks at the entrance and kind of to prevent attacks from happening. And the second one I'll mention is collaboration and sharing, because we spoke about how the attackers are kind of more organized and more structured, and we could be more organized in learning and structured in learning, and we could see that where we became more organized and structured, we were able to contribute to better counter cyber activities. In some of the examples even mentioned today, this evening, were examples where we specifically showed how collaboration between entities help, protect better the world and make it a safer place. So these are my 2.
Great. Joe?
Well, I should go off the second one Tori mentioned, right? When we got together, Michael, when you shared, we have more headquarters of CTA entities outside the U.S. now for the first time. That was news to me. That was fantastic, and I know we're sharing. And another number you shared was 350,000 observables shared, over a certain period of time. And we've been really consistent about that. It's like, hey, that's all got to contribute to just, us helping in the cost of this, right? So, I think we can give ourselves a little bit of credit for it, and I hope that we can further expand on the success we've built. We certainly saw the case of Conti guys when they do not collaborate, and that was so let's not be that. Let's not be that. I think the good guys unite, the good guys work together, good guys share, and then continue to expand our message. And that's doing our part in doing our part in defense in depth and prevention. Also, I think it's great.
Yeah, it was so sad to see that happen to Conti. Yeah, no, it was. John, so I'll give you the last word here.
So, I think I echo the sharing of information. We cannot do this alone, and no entity can try to accomplish this by themselves. I think we have still some more work to do with our developers and our environments in development to shore those up a little bit more. I don't have the silver bullets, but I think we've got to have some focus there. I think the increased maturity of some of the up and coming companies within sort of different undeveloped countries or less developed countries, I think that maturity needs to rise up, and I think we need to bring them. More sophisticated companies need to bring them into the fold, if you will. To Joe's point, we have a model that works certainly within the CTA itself that has been very, very useful, and moving those data points across helps shore up our defenses. And to Dorit's point about protection, the more we can do that across multiple entities, I think we're going to be better off as far as identification and prevention. So information sharing is absolutely critical from country to country. And again, one of the blockers in a lot of countries is that, the privacy issues as it relates to, personal data of individuals among that country, right? It gets a little bit challenging when we start talking about, searching for cyber criminals, but it gets even more dicey, if you will, or cloudy in going and looking for individuals that are part of anonymous organizations, for example. So we need to be very cautious on how we do that, but I think we need to improve our capabilities to, I hesitate to use the word offensive, but we need to start preparing for how that capability might exist in the future. So those are kinds of things I think we need to look at in 23 and into 24.
Yeah, and I think that's all right. And I think to me, weirdly, in some ways, I think I draw some strands of optimism from what we've been able to do in 2022. We were able to mobilize and support Ukraine, for example. We have been driving better collaboration and better information sharing. We've got examples where we now have many more governments working very hard on this issue. And so I think we know now we have some examples of success, right? And we know that we can do it, and we can build on that. Well, I want to thank Joe and Dorit and John for chatting with me this afternoon to, on all these topics. I think it's a very rich area. We could, of course, go on, but we are at time, and I very much appreciate your participation in today's discussion. And with that, we'll close out the webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.